The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Going Off the Grid, Disaster Resilience and Off-Grid Energy. This is co-hosted as usual by the Low Carbon for Energy and Development Network and Smart Villages. Today we're joined by four great speakers. We'll start with Bernie Jones of Smart Villages, to be followed by Seng of the University of College London. She will be followed then by Tariq Zaman of UNIMAS in Malaysia, and finally Shorna Allred of Cornell University. Each presenter will speak for about 10 minutes and leaving time for Q&A at the end. So we'd like to ask you to be sure to send in all your questions while the speakers are talking, and let us know which speaker your question is directed to. That way when we get to the Q&A we can make sure that they're answering your questions. They may also now, of course, I can't promise, but they may also write to you written responses during the course of the webinar as well, especially if it's just a quick question. And we also encourage you to go to our website. So you'll see down here, hopefully you can see in the chat box, our website addresses. So e4sv.org, that's a Smart Villages website, and lcedn.com, and that's their website. You can also catch up with us on our Twitter accounts with lots of useful information on both of our accounts. So we're at E4 Smart Villages, and LCEDN is at UK LCEDN. So we're really pleased to have you all here today. I see there are still people entering the room. So what I'd like to do first are a couple of really quick polls, and this just kind of lets us know a little bit about our audience today. So I'm going to start off with a poll asking you where you live. So let me go ahead and launch that poll. All right, so you can see here on the screen, we want to know where you live. So we've tried to make today's webinar accessible to people around the world. One of our speakers is in Malaysia, so it's about 10 p.m. his time. For me, I'm based in the US today, so it's about 8 a.m. where I am. So we're just curious to know how many people we have from all the different areas of the world. Okay, great. So I'm just going to close that poll. If you want to vote, any last votes, go right ahead. Okay, great. I'm going to close that poll, and I'm going to share that with you as well, so you can see where everybody is dialing in from today. Okay, great. So we've got a pretty nice balance. We've got about 22% in North America, 11% in South America, 17% in Africa and the Middle East, 39% in Europe, and 11% in Asia, broadly speaking. Okay, that's great. So what I'm going to do now is ask you one more question. We'd like to kind of know your profession and your field of work, and maybe a little bit what brings you here today. So what is your profession or field of work? Are you working as a researcher perhaps, or in academia more generally? Maybe you're working for the government, or you're a policymaker or regulator. We usually have quite a few entrepreneurs in the audience as well. Maybe you're working for a nonprofit or an NGO, and as well maybe you work in the private sector more generally. So I'll just give you a few more seconds to vote in on that one. I know some of you are still arriving. Welcome. This is today's webinar, Going Off the Grid, Disaster Resilience and Off-Grid Energy. We're really pleased to have you here today, and we have a number of really excellent speakers who we are going to go to just after we finish the polls. Okay, great. So I'm just going to close that poll since most people voted, and let me share the results of that with you. Okay, great. So we've got quite a strong turnout from people working as researchers or in academia today. We don't have any policymakers, that's too bad, but hopefully some of them will dial in a little later in the course of the webinar. 10% entrepreneurs, 24% working for nonprofits, and 19% working in the private sector. So I'd just like to extend a welcome to all of you here today. Thank you so much for taking the time in your various time zones, whether it's early for you or afternoon or quite late in the day. I think what I'll do now is go to our first speaker. So this is Dr. Bernie Jones. He is one of our co-leaders from the Smart Villages project. Bernie, are you there on the line?
I'm here, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, what I think we can do is actually, I'm just going to send you a request to share your screen. Let me just check that it is the right one. Let me know if you get the pop-up and that you're able to start sharing your screen.
No, I'm not cutting anything.
Okay, let me try one more time. That should be fine now.
There we go. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. We'll just make sure that that's all coming up fine for everybody in the audience. Just a second. Beautiful. It's full screen. So Bernie, thank you so much for being here with us today. And it's a pleasure to work with you on Smart Villages. And we're really interested to hear everything you have to say on disaster and resilience. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everybody joining us. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the concept of smart villages and community resilience as it was discussed at the workshop that we ran back in May of this year in Singapore with the Asia Research Institute at the university there. Just to give a little bit of context as to why we're interested in this subject, and also to let you know some of the conclusions of that event. So just to rehearse again, what we call a smart village is a concept for off-grid rural communities which are able to get some decentralized energy infrastructure, so to bring energy into those off-grid communities, but then to use it in a smart and innovative way, so to bring in communication services and networking with other communities, and to harness that energy to do things like bring in remote health services and remote education services, and to set up micro-enterprises in the community to add value to locally grown agricultural produce, things like that. And therefore to make sure that the whole community is engaged with the technology and the rural development that can bring. We're also looking at a number of different sorts of shocks, so not just natural disasters that we're all familiar with, but economic shocks. For example, sudden increases in prices, or increases in the cost of kerosene, maybe, or even grid electricity, if there is some option for that. Internal conflict within a country, within a region, can obviously cause a severe shock to local communities. There can be health shocks, epidemics that arise, and also infrastructure failure. So, for example, if there is a grid connection to a community, but the quality of the grid is poor and the grid infrastructure fails, then we're also talking about how decentralized energy supplies can support that. So the event that we held was in May with the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, and I think that we've shared with you the links for the policy brief to come out of that, and indeed the workshop report, and I encourage you after the webinar very much to go and have a look at that and some of the material in there, and other material on our website. So I'm now going to just take you through a few little examples of cases that we heard both at that workshop and in general through our Smart Villages project, which illustrate what the connection can be between off-grid energy and disaster resilience. So in Singapore, a speaker from Nepal told us about the effects of the earthquake that hit there in 2015, which everybody will remember. Of course, one of the first things to happen was that in the capital, Kathmandu, all the centralized infrastructure failed. So that's energy infrastructure, mobile phone masts fell over, so people were left without energy and without communications. However, the finding was that in some of the villages in the country which had their own energy supplies, so long as they were far enough from the epicenter of the earthquake, they were actually able to respond reasonably well to that disaster, especially some of the villages where our speaker had been working to build the social capital of that community, to work with the communities and the community leaders on thinking about ways that they could make their community more resilient, so by harnessing traditional knowledge and thinking about things like everyday resilience, so that resilience wasn't just an exercise the community went through in the face of a terrible disaster like the one that happened, but also everyday micro disasters which happen are responded to through the same sorts of principles, which makes the whole community very much more aware of resilience and disasters and how to respond to them. And a key issue there as well was the concept of build back better. If ever any infrastructure or structure was damaged, it should be replaced in a better and more resilient fashion to what was there before, and I think that's also a key principle. Going to West Africa, we were told by partners in Nigeria that one of the most interesting things from the terrible 2014-16 Ebola outbreak there was that it arose in villages in northern Guinea where there was very little or no communications ability. The fact that there was no communications links meant that when the symptoms were first observed in those villages, it was not possible for the community there to get a medical diagnosis of what those symptoms were. Had they even had a simple mobile phone link to a health practitioner, the health practitioner would have immediately recognized the symptoms of Ebola, and the health services in those countries could have quarantined those villages and responded to the outbreaks immediately. So by some arguments, even the provision of basic communications infrastructure there would have saved more than 11,000 lives and all of the other consequences. And of course, not just the money that the international response to the emergency took, but also the estimated $2 billion impact on the GDP of those three countries. In one of our first webinars, we had the speaker, Julia MacDonald, who is an energy engineer from Australia, who had done quite a bit of work in Tuvalu, where over the island chain there are very, very stretched supply chains. So some of the out islands there relied on diesel for their local electrical generators. But the diesel could only be supplied in boats which called maybe once every month and a half, and took about a day to get there. When typhoons came through the area, though, not only were the shipping schedules disrupted, but in some cases, as you can see in the pictures here, the actual harbors were destroyed. So the supply chains were not only disrupted, but actually cut for a period of time. So by providing appropriate local technology and building the capacity of the populations there, they were able to make them independent of the supply chains, and also to enable them to think of ways of hardening their energy solutions. So because they were relying on a hybrid system for solar panels and diesel backup, when they had typhoon warnings, they were able to demount the solar panels and keep them safe from the winds, and then after the typhoon had passed, they were able to put them back out. And the final example we're going to talk about is from the MS Swaminathan Research Centre in southeastern India. They established a series of what they call village knowledge centres, where they just provided some ICT infrastructure in a number of rural communities, mainly to help with work skills in those communities and basic training. What was interesting, though, was that ICT infrastructure was then used to also harness other knowledge which is key for the communities, in particular things like weather forecasts for the fishing communities. And the villages also started sharing that information with each other, so a sort of a peer-to-peer exchange of weather conditions and fishing conditions. That turned out to have collateral benefits. So just from the sharing the knowledge about where there were storm surges, where there were particularly high wave heights in the area, meant that the fishermen could avoid those areas and avoid going out at those times. And the MS Swaminathan Research Centre estimates that that technology in that project has saved more than 90 fishermen's lives so far over the 2 years that it's been running. So those are just some illustrations of the sorts of connections that we've been told between smart villages and rural community resilience. So the main findings to come out of the workshop were that to really build resilience in the community needs building social capital, so to increase the capacity and the information that's available to the people that live in that community. And that, if it's coupled then with physical infrastructure in the community, particularly decentralized energy services, and also using those energy services innovatively to enable those communities to access information, to access health services, And for some critical things like lighting, does help to make that community more resilient. There are some further findings that you can read about in more detail in the workshop report. One of the key things, maintenance of the infrastructure, not just construction, is key, and that this concept that we talked about earlier, that resilience has to be part of the everyday life of the community, not just an emergency thing. It has to be in everybody's everyday sort of lexicon. There are some unintended consequences as well, of course, of introducing the new technologies, and communities need to be aware of the new risks that those bring in. And finally, we need some more examples of actually how this works in real life, and some people to actually study the real-world linkage between the energy and the community resilience. Our policy suggestions then is that because governments, it should be in government's interest to provide some decentralized rural infrastructure like energy, because it can be much faster and much cheaper than trying to supply centralized infrastructure. That also has the collateral benefits of helping rural disaster recovery, which, if you're in an environment where disasters, natural or man-made, are inevitable, lets you really sort of kill two birds with one stone. And our argument therefore is that for the same money, with the same projects, you can not only achieve a measure of disaster resilience, but also go some way to achieving all of the sustainable development goals for your rural communities as well. So thank you very much. That is our introduction to the subject.
Thank you so much, Bernie. That's a really great overview, and I hope it gives the audience kind of a bit of a taster of what's to come in the webinar. So thank you so much, Bernie. Okay, so for our next presenter, now we're going to delve a little bit more into some specific case studies. So our next speaker is Seng of the University of College London. And I am just going to switch over to her screen, if you just bear with us just a few seconds. And I'm going to take her off of mute here. Hi, Seng. Good morning, or good afternoon, rather, since you're in the UK.
Hi, Lolly. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, thank you.
Is the screen sharing working well?
It's working perfectly. From what I can see, it's full screen. So, so please, we'd love to hear about your work in Nepal.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the great presentation, Lolly. I think it really leads in really well. You even introduced some of the elements about Nepal as well, which I found really interesting from your workshop. So today I'm going to talk about a survey that my colleagues and I conducted earlier this year, only 4 months ago, after the earthquake in Nepal, about how community resilience could be enhanced using renewable energy. And we have some preliminary results for you today. I'm talking on behalf of myself, colleague Niraj Subedi from Nepal, Ben Campbell from Durham University, Rocio Carrera, and Jakob Mulugeta, both from University College London, where I work. We're at the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, Public Policy, which gives you a flavor of the kind of approach that we might take. So it's about looking at evidence and how that feeds into public policy processes. So by way of background, as Bernie mentioned, the Nepal earthquake was last year, and it was actually 2 large earthquakes with many aftershocks in between. So it caused a lot of damage in terms of loss of life, and it was also in very highly populated areas like Kathmandu. And so many people were displaced from their homes, and lots of infrastructure was destroyed, including energy infrastructure. So working with my colleagues there, we made a few observations. So the first was that communities were really salvaging systems. There's anecdotal evidence about this. And there was also evidence in the literature about small-scale renewable energy systems perhaps being a more resilient energy option because of their decentralized nature. And we really wanted to build up the evidence base for both of these sort of observations to get some empirical evidence for this. So we're interested in collecting information about what communities were doing and whether communities have access to different kinds of energy systems like renewable energy, centralized grid energy, or traditional energy, which groups were more resilient and what kind of strategies did each group use after the earthquake. And the aim really was to see if we could improve management of disasters around this energy sector. Could we design energy systems better to improve community resilience in the long-term development sense? And what kinds of support can we give to communities straight after the disasters, given what they're already doing themselves? So we had a pilot study which ran in 4 districts and 16 villages. So we interviewed 160 households with a wonderful organization called Square One Research and Training based in Kathmandu. Also 16 focus group discussions in each one of those villages. And we also did 2 informal interviews and a mapping of the governance, formal and informal governance structures in those villages. So today I'm going to go through each one of these kinds of data and give you a bit of an insight from the preliminary analysis that we've been able to do so far. And this is feeding into the Nepalese government's own reconstruction programs and also will be of interest, of course, to the international community. So with the household surveys and interviews, we can see that most households had re-established some kind of energy access after the earthquake. So this was very heartening, that some technologies were we found that some technologies were more easily deployable and repairable by the community after the disaster. So for example, use of more portable technologies like solar lanterns. We also found that repair of biogas piping was also being done by communities, but not if there was damage to other parts, then it was more difficult for them to repair. And also communities were doing repairs to improve cook stoves in households. So this was something that they had the capacity to look after. And most households also used fuel stocking or multiple sources of energy as an energy resilience strategy. So this is an observation that about the energy ladder then. So for example, some households with solar home systems and battery lamp systems, they use these as a complement to the national grid and local hydro plants. So when these failed, people tended to switch back to these other kinds of energy systems, so the solar home systems and the battery lamps. And the same thing happens for cooking as well. So people who used to have access to LPG gas and improved cook stoves, if the supply chain had been disrupted or the equipment damaged during the earthquake, they tended to switch back to secondary traditional firewood stoves. And when things became available again, depending on the pricing, they would switch back. So with the focus group discussions, we really captured a sense of just how vulnerable people felt during and immediately after the earthquake, and the need to kind of have a group sense of feeling safe. Taking care of their communities was really important, or their neighbors was really important, families. And that it really caused a big disruption to their normal everyday life. They also described different ways in which they engaged with the state and with non-government organizations and with other kinds of community groups to gain access to services like energy. But there was still very much a sense that they were making do. They were just in this first stage of recovery, and that just beginning to engage with actors as well. We also did some mapping of the governance structures within those villages. So this is just a representation of the whole informal governance network, with the circles representing the actors themselves and the lines representing access to services such as energy or healthcare or immediately after the earthquake. So from this you can see that international NGOs and government played a really big role in access to these kinds of services. But also that friends and relatives and more local forms of governance and local non-government organizations also played a very important role in access to all sorts of services. What's interesting then is that when we pull out the results for energy access, we can see actually that if you add up the help that people sought from private parties, local NGOs, relatives, and neighbours, it outweighed the immediate assistance they got from government and international NGOs. So it is slightly different for access to energy services as for access to other services combined. So we found this to be a really interesting result. So of course we're continuing to analyze each one of these areas, but our preliminary conclusions are that households and communities are indeed very proactive in restoring energy services, and they've been successful in doing some of that in Nepal, along with assistance from other institutions. They really use grassroots institutional resources, and there were definitely some changes to their energy routines as well. Full restoration of the energy services in Nepal has been very slow, and that energy really is a key idiom for the continued disruption that people feel in their everyday lives after the earthquake. So it's a real something that's very important to people. We also observed inequalities in terms of which communities managed to get access to energy services after the earthquake. So for example, some microhydro plants have been repaired and some not. Some biogas plants have been repaired and some not, and by the community or international NGOs. And I'm quite interested in looking at what factors played into that ability to be able to repair things. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seng. That's a really fascinating case study. I think in the Q&A, the audience themselves and myself as well, we'd like to follow up on some of these final points that you show here, especially that question about the inequalities. And it's also really great to hear how proactive the households and communities have been in restoring their own energy services, and kind of brings us back to this point about communities being involved and empowered. So I want to thank you for that, and we're going to come back to you in the Q&A to follow up some of these very interesting results or preliminary results that you've shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing the question.
Thank you. Okay, so great. So next we are going to move over to Tariq Zaman. So let me just do a little switch over here. Bear with me just like 2 seconds. And so Tariq, are you there on the line?
Yes, I'm here, Marie.
All right,
Thank
wonderful.
You.
Well, we are ready to switch gears. So we're switching gears from earthquakes in Nepal over to talking about an example that I know you've been working on for many years in Sarawak. And in Long Lamai specifically, so we're really keen to hear your presentation and continue this great conversation that we're having today. So I will let you continue, and your presentation is perfectly full screen. So please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, and good day to all. My name is Tariq Zaman, and I'm working with University of Malaysia, Sarawak. We are based in East Malaysia, at Kuching, and the communities that we are working, one of the community is at the Long Lamai, which is at the border between Indonesia and Malaysia. So just with a brief background of the community is a small community of 598 of the population of the village and 116 households, with a church building and a government primary school, but there is no health clinic, and there is very limited access to electricity. Recently started in mobile coverage. As well as University of Malaysia Sarawak has a telecenter project in this community since 2009. In terms of social and cultural structure, this community with the recent past, so they were nomads and they settled at this location in 1950s. This specific community tribe is called Penang, and they are also somehow in media has been promoted as the last nomad of Borneo. Some of the recent events, like the past recent events which have happened with this community and the people in the community, the transformation from nomadic lifestyle to semi-nomadic and now to the settled life. And they were nomads, so of course they were hunter-gatherers, and after the settlement in 1950s they start farming. In 1960s and 70s they had their church schools, and in 1970 they got a government school, which was the first big change in the community to get access to education. One of the big events which happened in this community, because this community, even after settlement, they were much more dependent on the nearby forest where they were located. But in 1991, they have lost all nearby forest in a massive fire incident, which really affected the community livelihood, and the other part was of the other force was also the external pressure and their connection to the outside world. And because of the pressure on their livelihood, there was big migration of youth to the nearby town, and then more and more dependency on instead of their forest, but on town lifestyle and the amenities from the towns. After this fire incident, and for next 15 years there was no more, not very much activity in the community. But in 2007, 8, since then UNIMAS contacted this community to be partner in research and development projects. One of the initial project which we started with Long Lamai community was giving them access to ICT through telecenter, and this telecenter is powered up by solar system. And after they got access to ICT, the next question was, of course, why they were interested to have this access to ICT, because of, and it is normally asked, because of their dependency on cash income. So they were really looking for generating some cash income opportunities, and through access to ICT they were looking for, one thing was to promote their tourism in the village, but the other part was also to sell their handicrafts. UNIMAS has also worked with them on coming up with the contemporary design of handicraft and giving them access to the market. Other than that, they also got an access to Allred energy in 2011. Half of the community got, and the other half still dependent on either petrol gensets or other means. But this is they have still access to majority of them have access to the off-grid energy. With these all changes which were happening, so one of the big problem which the community elders were already aware about the lifestyle was changing with these new things coming into the community and the development opportunity which they were getting. But they were, this is one of the, which I'm sharing here, is one of the quotation from a newspaper by the village headman, where he's mentioning that internet has opened their eyes to the outside world and tourism, but tourism can also bring a lot of other changes to the community, negative influences, but on the other side, they think that their resilience system can work if they have a very clearly set rules for control. And other than this development project, there are other interventions where the government is engaging the community. For example, at this moment, the community is only accessible by boats. You can reach the community by taking a small twin otter from nearby town to another location, Longvanga, which is a village, and from there you need to take a 2 hours boat ride, small boat ride. In that boat only 2 people can sit to reach to that community. So that is the only practical way to access this community. The government has is also negotiating with the village to give them access by road, but the community is taking it they are thinking that they are not yet ready to get that access. And what are the reasons for this? So we have done a small study with some of the village elders that during all this time of semi-nomadic and settled life, what are their main lessons learned where they are working on different development projects within outside world. So one of the things that I mentioned is that if they would like to work with any development project, they would like to be engaged in a long-term prior agreement where the community are aware about the pros and cons of the initiative, and their role in the initiative is very much important with what are the expectations of the partner organization from the community that they can build. The second very much important aspect is the social capital of the community. Community mentioned, the elders of the community mentioned that for them the community cohesion is very important. So whatever comes to the community, it should have a positive impact on overall community. Our community can have the control of the development initiative. One of our recent study on energy preferences in this community, the interesting variable which community really supported is the operational model, where they would like to have community operators model rather than the government operator model. So they are very much in favor of that. So they would like to have the control of their decisions, and they would like to have the control of their resources. The third one, which was very interesting that they have mentioned, is about local capacity building, because the community is only transformed in the last 50 years. And they think that they still lack local capacity to meet up with the new the needs of the new development initiative. So whatever programs is, if the partner would like to work with them, the program should have a strong component of building local capacity inside community to catch up with the demand or with the needs of the project. Thank you with this, and I'm quite happy to have the discussion in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tariq. Thank you for this very interesting case study, and I'm sure we're going to follow up with you with some questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Let me just remind the audience to please send in your questions. We're very interested to hear what questions you might have, whether it's for Bernie, whether it's for Long Seng, whether it's for Tariq. And we're going to move to our next presenter now. This is Shorna Allred from Cornell University. And let me just send her the request to share her screen, and we'll get started in her presentation. Hi, Shorna, are you there? I think we may still have Shorna on mute, but it's, oh, I think it's working now. Yeah, I hear you now.
Great.
Wonderful, wonderful. And
okay, can you see my screen?
Maybe in just a second. I saw that you clicked the full screen button. Let me see. Let me just send you, let's see. If you'll bear with me just 1 second, I'm going to send you the request again because it didn't show up this time.
Okay.
So let me just try that one more time.
Okay.
Okay, so it should be sending you the request, and perfect, yeah, so it's full screen this time. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today, Shorna, and as I understand it, you're going to be talking about Thailand in particular, so we're changing geographies once again, and thanks for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the invitation to be part of the panel today. And so I'd like to share some work that we've been doing in the region of Bang Rakam, Thailand, looking at the issue of community flood resilience. And just wanted to acknowledge our collaborators at Mahidol University and the Office of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation in Thailand. And so one of the things that I wanted to start with is just thinking about what is community resilience, and it's really about capacity, the capacity to withstand shocks or disturbances and undergo changes or adaptations, but to still retain key elements of the structure and identity that really preserve the distinctness of communities. So how do communities adapt in that way? And so this concept of participatory knowledge management is very critical for resilience, that the idea that different types of knowledge are required for resilience, not only scientific knowledge, but also local or traditional knowledge, and also thinking about the processes by which knowledge is attained, produced, recognized, and prioritized. And so resilience really, in terms of the literature and how it's described, really emerges from a set of networked adaptive capacities. And as some of the previous presenters have shown, particularly Tariq, ICT, information and communication technologies, are critical domains of resilience. And so when we think about community resilience, it emerges from these sets of adaptive capacities: economic development, social capital, adaptive capacities, community competence, resource robustness, and it's really about how these different capacities interact with each other to form community resilience. And so I won't go into all of these, but I put it here in the slide if people would like more information about what each of these elements mean in terms of adaptive capacities. And this was something that we really focused on in this research, was the idea of institutional memory, innovative learning, and a sense of connectedness, that those are really critical aspects, this intergenerational knowledge and how it's passed down within the institutions, within the community, social institutions, etc., and how communities learn to adapt utilizing this type of knowledge. And so the research that we undertook was to investigate how flood knowledge is transferred within the community, what aspects of the community contribute to resilience, and how flood knowledge has changed over time. And in 2011, Bangkok withstood significant flooding in 2011. Over 13 million people were affected. Over 800 people perished in that flood. And so one of the things we did was to look retrospectively at the recent floods that had happened and look at how it had impacted the community and how decision making was impacted. And so we worked in the area of Bangwar Kam, Thailand, which is here where the arrow is along the Tachin River, which is a tributary that flows into the Gulf of Thailand. We used narrative interviews and audio recorded them, undertook translation and thematic coding, and we developed what are called community flood narratives to really look at how the community, what the community narrative was around the flood preparation, and really looking at those dimensions of resilience that I mentioned before. And one of the things we found was that even though the flood in 2011 was pretty catastrophic, that the area was subject to regional flooding typically on a yearly basis, but not as severe as it was in 2011. And so they talked about how, this is a quote from one of the interviewees, that floods impact everyone and everything, and they've lived during the floods for their entire life. And they can adapt because they face floods every year, more seasonal type flooding than the flooding that happened in 2011. And with regard to flood knowledge, all of the interviewees talked about how they would know that the flooding was coming based on past experience and natural indicators of flooding. And so those were things such as, being aware of the water levels. It was also the moon calendar, having a sense of how the ebb and flow of tides based on the moon calendar, and then also ant behavior and things like that they sensed when heavy rains were coming. And they indicated also that in recent past, there's more reliance on the sub-district administrative organization, which is a local unit of government, to notify village leaders of when the flooding would come. And some of them used mass media to access information, but they indicated they were relying pretty heavily on the local government. Adaptations in this region are, in terms of housing, most of the village houses are built on stilts, as you can see here in the photograph, and a lot of transportation by boats. And so during the flood, most of the farmers in the region had boats, and so they were able to still get around even though it was flooded. The flooding lasted for several months, so they had to figure out how to live with water during this time period. There were also changes in the crops that were grown by the farmers, and so they indicated that they had to really grow more short-term plants during the flood, and so the fruit trees, which were a source of income for the farmers in the area, they take many years to mature, and so they had to look at growing things like morning glory and flowers and things that could be replanted quickly after the flood. They also indicated more of a reliance on modern medicine versus the use of Thai herbs in the past. So this was, again, in the context of changes that they had seen in their community, and how that was really changing where they get their information about health, for example. And so with regard to flood knowledge, everyone really emphasized observation as a main way of learning about how to prepare for floods and take care of floods during take care of each other during the flood. And a few, but not many, were passing on the flood knowledge to their children in terms of being able to look at water levels and understand them, and understanding the moon calendar. And one of the local government officials that was interviewed expressed concern about children moving out of the villages for work or for education, losing the attachment to nature. But not all interviewees shared that particular concern. And most thought that schools should teach more about flood preparation, that there was a need to really integrate flood knowledge into the school system, that integration of flood knowledge into the community was being lost. And so one interviewee talked about the strength of the community and how people really relied on each other for support, that really increases the strength of the community and increases knowledge. One interviewee actually talked about how government reliance on information about flooding actually has led people to be more independent and not reach out and help other people in the community as it was in the past. So we saw two different narratives about that in the interviewees. For example, here's a counter narrative to that families are really, sharing the foods that they grow or the fish that they catch. Again, because this community had to they had to live with flooding conditions for several months, so they had to figure out how to grow food and eat, transportation, all of this during the time period. And so some of the conclusions that that emerged from the research was that knowledge about flooding is transferred primarily through observation, and that villagers would like to be informed earlier about the volume and velocity of water, and the natural ways of doing that are not necessarily being transferred to the next generation. And community members often needed to adapt the crops that they planted to be able to withstand these longer flooding periods. And there was this idea of community solidarity during the flood and reliance on other village members, but of course not everyone experienced that or shared that particular view, but most did. This idea of the social capital and relationships in the community, being able to draw on those in times of disaster. And then some believe that the reliance on government and the local government, the sub-district administrative organization, has contributed to a decrease in local flood knowledge as people become dependent on external sources of information, that they're less reliant and less apt to pass on the local knowledge. And so some felt that was a downside of the government providing information. So there was this need to really balance both the scientific information coming from government about flooding, and then being able to retain some of that local knowledge and those integrated knowledge networks. Thank you very much. I just wanted to share a little bit about the Bon-Recom research, and still allow a few minutes for questions from the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shorna. Thank you for that great example, and I think it's really wonderful to have all of these kind of case studies today, so that we can see really the variety and the diversity of challenges facing different communities in different places. So I think what we will do now, we will begin our Q&A session. I'm going to return back to Bernie, so we'll follow the same order of the presenters that we've already heard from. Bernie, are you there on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Hi, Bernie. So I just wanted to follow up with you on one thing, because recently we held a workshop focusing on Central America and the Caribbean. And we had a session in there discussing disaster and resilience, and I thought you might want to just take a minute or two and bring in some of the lessons learned from that particular session, or how they might relate to some of the other points that you made, maybe especially kind of like Tuvalu and the challenges that islands face.
Sure. So the event that we had for the Caribbean and Central America was really interesting, because that is one of the regions of the world which has particular susceptibility to natural disasters, both on the mainland as well as in the island chains. And it's an interesting area, because quite a lot of the islands in the Caribbean actually have full grid access or near full grid access for their populations. So talking to some of the representatives from those islands, at first they couldn't really see that there was anything in the smart villages concept that that was of interest to them. But I think this is really where this sort of nexus between the sort of off-grid energy and the services that can bring in, where the nexus between that and then disaster resilience, and also a degree of energy security comes in, because those same islands which have near universal electrification are also 100% dependent on fossil fuel imports to generate their electricity, as a result of which their energy prices are already at about 3 times the world mean price. And when oil prices increase, the prices can even go up to, say, $1 per kilowatt hour, which is a crippling charge to have to pay for some of the poorer members of those communities. So I think it was quite interesting for those countries to see this whole sort of area of off-grid energy as not something particularly that would drive rural development, but as something that would really enhance their resilience to natural disasters at the same time as it could increase their national energy security and make themselves less dependent on these expensive fossil fuel imports. And of course, at the same time, the region, the Caribbean region and Central America is very diverse, because at the same time as it has countries like Barbados and Panama with near 100% connection rates to the grid, it also has Haiti, which is the country with the highest off-grid population percentage in the world, and where even repeated efforts that are made to try to provide services to the population are constantly affected by new floods, new disasters. Even while we were there last week, there were new floods in the region causing problems. So I think that region actually illustrates particularly well how all of these different things can fit together.
Thanks so much, Bernie. And we're going to move over real quick to Long Seng, because I know she has to leave in just a moment. Long Seng, I think you probably have to go, as far as I understand. Is that correct? But we want to...
Sorry. I'm very sorry. I do have to go.
That's no problem. That's no problem. So for everybody in the audience, if you had a question for Long Seng, please feel free to send it to me after the webinar. Actually, I'm just going to pop my email address here in the chat box. It's molly@e4sv.org. So if you do have a question for Long Seng, just let me know, and I will pass that along to her. And we really want to thank you for being here today. We know you have to go, and thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Molly, and I look forward to receiving the questions via email.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Bye-bye. So, okay, great. So sorry we don't get to follow up with Long Seng. I know there were a lot of interesting points in her presentation that we want to follow up with, so we will pass your questions along to her. And as you can see, I've put my email address there in the chat box, molly@e4sv.org, and send me any of your questions in that case. So now what I'd like to do is go to Tariq, so still following the order of our presentations. Tariq, we had a really interesting questions come through, and this question was about, really the core of the question is about how to increase resilience and reduce social and economic vulnerability. And I know that's kind of a broad question, but whether it's in the case of energy or whether it's in the case of other things, like Shorna was talking to us about, the knowledge that's passed on between generations, for example, local knowledge. So what do you think? How can we increase resilience and reduce this type of social and economic vulnerability? And also, I think what came up in Long Seng's presentation is also this point about inequality. Could you speak to that in the case of Sarawak, in the case of Long Lamai?
Okay, in the case of what I understand is that from the question that how we can increase the resilience, and what's the second part of the question?
And how can we reduce vulnerability, especially social and economic vulnerability? so that communities are stronger?
Oh, okay. So in our case, what we are experiencing, or what we are at this moment working on, that how to, it is not to to decrease the vulnerability, but how to strengthen the existing resilience structure inside the community. So for example, the community where we are working, so our experience is mainly with the indigenous communities. So this indigenous community is very much egalitarian in nature. The issue which they are facing is that with the outside pressure and with the new, with the changing lifestyle and the changing governance structure in the community, they are also facing oppression on their resilience system. And what I mentioned, the 3 lessons learned from the community members, that these are their experiences, that if they work in such a way with these 3 basic principles, then it can help them to increase their resilience system, and it can help them to decrease the social vulnerability or economic vulnerability. For example, in this case, if you really look at Long Lamai community, they are coming up with the, they are opening door for tourism industry. Now with the tourism industry, if you look at the different model, it's really very much individualistic and competitive with each other. But Long Lamai community is trying to adopt really a community-based model. So for example, their homestays or their boats, they are taking turn by turn to give benefit to all the community members to have access to some sort of a cash income. So I think this is, with this example, maybe I give some direction in that from our experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that sounds very, very relevant. So yeah, for them, it's really crucial to have that cash income in order to kind of improve their community's strength and potentially their resilience to things that might happen, like the fire that they experienced in 1991. Okay, that's great. I'm going to move to Shorna now. Thanks so much for that response, Tariq. And Shorna, I'd kind of like to pose to you the same question about, I mean, you addressed it quite a lot in your presentation, but this question of how to increase resilience and reduce vulnerability in communities. I mean, based on the results that you have, what for you is kind of the central point? What must change to ensure that that when the floods are coming, people really are not only prepared but really able to get back to normal as quickly as possible afterwards?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question, and I would respond to that by looking at resilience as a collective. That resilience is a property. It can be individual. There's like psychological resilience, but what I'm describing or referring to is this idea of community resilience as a collective mechanism within the community. And I think it's about engaging local people and creating those organizational linkages that boost and protect the support system, whether it's social, economic, or environmental. And I think so this idea of those linkages between people and between organizations is really critical. So I think the communication and knowledge networks are so essential, because if those are in place and the social cohesion, the social capital is in place, then regardless of what affects the community, those are assets and resources that can be drawn upon. There are already networks of where to go for information, who to contact, what people in the community and organizations you could reach out to that provide the social support system. And so I think that I think it's the relational aspect of resilience that's one of the most critical factors.
That's a really central point. I mean, I think if there's one thing that has come out of this webinar today, out of all of the presentations, it's very clear that there's this relational aspect of people relying on one another, people relying on knowledge that others have in the community and passing that on is really a crucial part of it. So I'm going to do just one more round. It's a quick round of questions to our presenters. So just coming back around to Bernie, I know we don't have a lot of policymakers in the audience today, but I think it's a really crucial point to talk about in terms of policy and also in terms of inequalities, which came up in Long Seng's presentation. Bernie, do you think in terms of policies, in terms of really the policy-making approach to disaster and resilience, is it going in the right direction in these cases that you've mentioned, or do you feel that some of the policies may be increasing inequalities? What do you think about this question?
That's a very interesting question. I was going to say I think the policy thinking on this is still a little bit disconnected in that the policymakers who are trying to plan for resilience and disaster response are typically not the same ones that are responsible for rural development. And therefore there's something to be gained by encouraging those two groups to think at the same time. My sense is that some of the most straightforward policy thinking in disaster resilience is about just supplying enough infrastructure to be able to respond to disasters. And I don't think enough thinking has gone into what all of the presenters today have been talking about, this idea of building the social capital of the community, preparing them to respond to disasters themselves and allowing them to do things like engage in economic activity so that they can build up their own assets and make themselves more readily able to respond and weather out the situations that disasters cause. So yes, I think for me, policy should focus a little bit more on that community preparedness and not just the response to disasters after they've happened.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, because I think exactly, it's got to be joined up. We can't just have communities who themselves are prepared, but at the same time, the government's not quite there, and they're thinking in a more reactive way instead of a proactive way potentially. So I'd like to hear now maybe from Tariq, in the case of Sarawak, what do you think? I mean, in terms of the way government policy approaches the people living in Sarawak, I mean, it's a very different lifestyle. It's a very different way of thinking. I mean, they were formerly nomadic and some are still semi-nomadic. Do you feel like it's joined up in this case between government policies on resilience in general or on disasters as well, and the thinking and the knowledge that's within that community? Do you feel those are joined up?
Okay, so some of the things which are really like from the last 2 years that we can see a lot of changes in the government policies towards engagement of the community. There are some big decisions made in terms of energy projects, like the big mega dams projects, and as well as access to energy. To provide access to energy is another priority for the government. Other than that is access to ICTs, and the rural transformations programs are going in. So those things are happening. On the other side, what we really found, we are trying to work with the government as well as with the community, really to highlight the issues of access to information and the gap in between the gap of that the communities are facing to reach their voice to the policymakers. So because with Sarawak, it's really different structure. Then there are a lot of infrastructural issues. Small communities are, and it is dispersed communities. And one of the things that even in UNIMAS has adopted, the university adopted in their strategic plan to engage the diverse and dispersed community and to work as a bridge between government and community and to provide them a platform where there could be a dialogue or where there could be platforms to build the capacities of not only community members, but how to convey their voices, but also on the other side to provide a platform to the government to have a reach to the communities.
Thank you, Tariq. Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is really academia can play a really central role in linking up government policy and the communities that you know so well, you have worked with so closely for so many years, to really link these up, create a dialogue, and especially your point about diverse and dispersed. I think that's a really central point because it is such a huge challenge with dispersed communities to ensure that they are properly involved in the policymaking process. So thank you so much for making those points, Tariq. So now I'd just like to turn to Shorna as our last question. So Shorna, I think you've addressed some of these points already in your presentation, but I did want to ask you, what your thoughts are in terms of the links between the government and the communities, especially in this question of information sharing, because I understood in your presentation that people really want to know about the volume and the velocity of the water, and that they really want this data that helps them to know how bad it's going to be. So what are your thoughts on this question of linking those, linking up the community level and the government level, and how that can improve things?
Yeah, another great question. And I think that with flood management and flood resilience, local approaches are essential because during a flood or any kind of natural disaster, you really need those you need robust and sound communication and social capital networks, if you will. And it's interesting because the natural ways of looking at flooding and water levels and things like that are not as, it's more challenging now because of the systems of canals and the irrigation department and kind of the decisions that they make about opening or closing floodgates. And so it's not just the natural processes of water and how it moves across a landscape. There's development and other things that increase the velocity of water in ways that it wasn't, 20, 30, 50 years ago. And so this idea of access to technical information is very much needed. And after the 2011 floods, the federal government in Thailand really put a lot of resources into community-based flood management because they realized that the key is to empower local communities through the local SAO offices, the sub-district administrative offices, to work with the villagers at the local level. That was really the avenue and mechanism that was going to be most effective. The challenge is, of course, how do you actually implement participatory processes that actually do engage communities at the local level so that you're tapping into their networks and letting them know how they can tap into yours, if you will, for the technical data. But it should go both ways, so that government is pushing information out to communities, but communities also have to be empowered to seek that information, and also have government listening to listening to the local knowledge that they have about the rivers and how they live with them, and how how they can access information about them, how they have adapted in the past and how they can do so in the future. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there with regard to that, those participatory processes for flood management that really do engage communities and agencies.
Thank you so much, Shorna. Yeah, I can't, I mean, after hearing everyone's presentations today, you know, it seems absolutely essential that we've got a two-way dialogue going on between governments and communities, and that is, it's really about communication, sharing information, and listening on one side and on the other side as well. So I want to thank you so much for your presentation, and I just wanted to mention real quick here that, sorry, yeah, we had a couple of other questions. I'm not able to kind of do another round of questions, but I did want to mention there's some interesting other work on this going on that's very interesting. For example, in relation to the Gender and Disaster Network, there are a number of universities, you know, as with all of those who are here today working on this topic. I'm going to try to include some of these links in the follow-up email so that people can explore this issue more. And we'd be really pleased. So if you have been in touch with me, please send me those links. My email address is molly@e4sv.org, and I'll be happy to get those out to the whole audience. Let me just take everybody off of mute here and just say thank you to all of you. Thanks for being here today. Thank you for discussing with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. This was a great opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And just a quick reminder to everybody, there will be a short survey after the webinar. So for those of you who are still online here, please feel free to fill in that survey. We'd love to know your thoughts on how the webinar went today, and to hear your ideas for follow-up webinars. So thank you all, and I wish you a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.